Hello everyone, this is Josh with T Firearms, and today, as you can tell, we're at the shop. That's because we're going to be doing something a little bit different today, kind of more of a hands-on, practical gunsmithing video, which hopefully we'll be doing a lot more of. Today we're going to be looking at trigger jobs and kind of what makes a trigger job good versus what makes one bad, and kind of dispel some of the myths and misconceptions around a trigger job. They're a little bit more complicated than what most people think, but actually still kind of easy as long as you understand some of the basic principles that go behind that. So, with all that being said, let's get after it. Alright, so what we have here are two very similar pistols. Over here we've got a Yugoslavian M57, and here we've got a Chinese Type 54. They're both essentially knockoffs of the Russian TT-33, which was very common during World War II and very popular. As such, they're going to have very similar operating systems with a few minor differences as we go through, and we'll discuss those once we get to them. Now, this one's one of our shop customs. It's already been worked over and has a very nice trigger in it. This one has been worked over a little bit by the customer, but he's still having some inconsistencies, and we'll discuss those as we get further on into this video. So starting out, let's get some basic measurements going on here. So for ours, we've got an 8.9 trigger pull, .89 trigger pull. Really light, really crisp trigger. And with the customer's gun, we've got looking at about the same trigger weight, and that's kind of one of the big differences with a lot of trigger pull jobs, is you'll have very similar weights and very different feels, and what we can feel as we're going through this is with this one here we've got an extremely slight take up, and then we hit that wall pretty quick, and then just a little bit of creep and a nice crisp break. Whereas with this one, we've got a very odd take up, and I don't know if you can see that, but there's a clickiness there before it takes up, and then we've got almost no wall, and then a very light pull. So it's especially that click right there. It's a very odd trigger pull. All right, so these are the main components we're going to be messing with today. Big one being this hammer here, the sear right here, the trigger bow, and then we've also got, there's a spring that's back here that is what the trigger goes back and forth using, or what moves the trigger back and forth. And all you got to do to pull it out is tip it forward and unhook it from, I don't know if you can see, there's a little pin in here. And I suspect this is a significant part of our issues here, is how dramatically this is bent forward. Normally they're more of a straight line, and they just bend forward. So we'll go ahead and take a little bit of this bend out, and I find the easiest way to do that is you take a hammer and you use the plastic side of it and just pop it a bit. Nothing crazy, but we've got it a little bit straighter, and that's going to give us consistent back and forth with it. So with that being done, we can push this back into its spot. And what this allows us to do is it removes that take up, because what it's doing is it's pushing this trigger bow here forward. So by reducing the bend in it, this is going to sit further back, and it's going to give us less slop going back and forth. So to pull this apart, we're going to go ahead and send the hammer forward, and to do that we just pull back on this and it goes. And then we will use a small punch. You got to be careful, it's got a spring in it and it'll try to get away from you, but you should just be able to push this larger pin out, like so. And then I like to hold on to everything, something like this, pull my punch out, and there we go. Now, on the Yugoslavian M57s, their ammunition was designed for submachine guns, and because of that, it has a very hard primer. So when they built their M57s, they used an extremely hard or heavy spring. This one's got a much lighter spring. I mean, I wouldn't be able to even remotely come close to compressing the spring on the M57. Because of that, sometimes you'll have to cut coils off. Now, the word to the wise about cutting coils off is, well, honestly, you should avoid it as much as possible. And the reason why is, much like a doctor, you don't want to harm your patients. With the gun, you don't want to change significant mechanical features about it, because once they're changed, oftentimes it's hard to get back, especially with springs. So if I can avoid cutting loops off of a spring, I will, as just something of a cautionary measure to avoid causing reliability issues and things of that nature. This one already has a light spring on it by comparison, so we don't need to mess with it at all. But I did want to point out the difference between it and the Yugoslavian M57. Now, with the hammer, we've got two sear catches on it. One is the half-cock notch, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but you've got that catch in there, and it basically locks around the sear. And then you've got the actual firing notch, and this one's just this is the one that interfaces with the sear and allows the gun to fire. And let's real quick, we'll pull this apart so you can see basically all the mechanical features that need to be interfaced with in order to make this a smoother running gun and a better running gun. So what we've got going on here is we've got this hammer trigger bow here. And so the trigger bow is going to sit like this on your sear. And as you pull your trigger back, this sear is going to go forward. And when it does that, it slides off of this notch here and allows the hammer to go forward and hit your primer. So the main surfaces we're going to be working on is going to be all of the interface points. So this one here where it interfaces with your sear, this one here where it interfaces with the trigger bow, this sear where it interfaces with the hammer. And that's pretty much it. Now this one's also having some slide issues, and I suspect that's because you've got these very hard corners. And so hard corners are a big deal, especially when you're doing trigger and action jobs. On parts that need to move together freely, you want to have rounded corners as opposed to sharp corners. And so what we're getting is, as we're pulling back the slide, it's catching on this and it's not moving slowly. So what I'm going to do is I'll take this over to the polisher and we'll round everything off and smooth it out. Now with triggers, you want the opposite of rounded corners, and that's how you get your crisp, what they call your glass rod break, is you have nice sharp corners that interface with each other. So if you have rounded corners, what they're going to do is they're going to grind and drag over one another before they finally slip off. Whereas if you've got sharp corners, they're going to drag a little bit and then break really easy and really crisp. And that's honestly the big difference between a good trigger job and a bad trigger job, is if you've got rounded corners on things. And you can't really see. What I'll do is I'll take some close-up pictures of these. But we've got some rounding on here. We've got a good bit of rounding on here and significant rounding on here, which I bet is what's causing that click that we're experiencing, along with the weird trigger spring. So what we're going to do is we're going to polish everything up, but as we're polishing everything up, we're going to pay very close attention to our corners and making sure that they are sharp, crisp edges as opposed to rounded edges. And that's a very common issue with surplus guns, is you just, by nature of having been used a lot, the corners are going to round out. And also cheaper surplus guns, because they were mass-produced, machining tolerances and quality control weren't that great. So a lot of times you'll see with surplus guns or with just well-used guns that they've got these rounded corners as opposed to these sharp, crisp ones. And we're looking for sharp, crisp ones. And that's really one of the biggest factors with a good trigger job versus a bad trigger job, because with a bad trigger job, you can have a low pull weight and it's still going to be gritty. It's going to have a lot of travel. It's going to have a lot of slop. and that's because they didn't pay close attention to sharp, crisp corners. So the tools I use to get these corners nice and sharp is I've got a diamond file here. And what I really use the diamond file for is to get the surface coating off. So in this case we've got Cerakote, but it can be bluing, parkerization, whatever's being used. But we're just going to get down to bare metal. And then once I've got down to bare metal, I'll, depending on the surface, either use different grits of India stones to go ahead and get that nice crisp edge. And it's very important that you pay close attention to your stones. So for example, we've got this one here is really well used, as you can see, and I actually need to clean it off a little bit. But we're starting to get rounding on our corners, whereas this one's essentially brand new. And we've got very crisp corners and a very flat surface. And when you're doing trigger jobs, if your India stones end up not being crisp and not being flat, that's going to impact your crisp corners on your job. And so with that being the case, it is extremely important that you take a look at your stones and throw them out once they get too rounded. Alright, so before we get started, one of the things I like to do to help reach into smaller spaces, like for example this notch here, is I will take some fine grit, normally 2000 grit sandpaper, and tape it to a popsicle stick. And I find that helps with getting in small places, because it does still have some flat surfaces. It helps retain that flat surface. And you can use both the thin skinny side, the thick side. You can cut them in half like what I've done with this one, and really tailor down very small stones essentially that are custom to what you're trying to do. Now we've already gone ahead and done this safety pin thing here. Just polished it up. And we did that using power tools, since we're not really concerned about our clean, crisp edges. But for the actual trigger components, we're going to use hand files, hand stones, and everything, because it's critical that we maintain that crisp edge. So let's get after it. Now we're going to go ahead and speed up about 40 minutes worth of work down to 3 minutes using the magic of editing. Starting out, we're going to be honing and truing all of the surfaces on our trigger bow, and what this is going to do is allow it to engage with the sear notch. As we go through this, you'll notice we're not removing a significant amount of material. We are more just polishing and leveling the surface that is already there so that it's going to fit up nicely, as we previously discussed. Which, as you can see here, we've got all of our parts nice and square. Now I'm going to start work on the nose of the sear. This is where the sear interacts with the hammer sear slot. With these sears, it's very important to not take off too much material. You just really want it to be lightly polished, and you want to continually check your engagement surfaces. This is one of those areas that's very easy to mess up and create a mechanical hazard with your firearm. So less is always more on these sears, and it's very important to make sure that you're checking it constantly. Now we're moving on to the hammer sear notch. You'll notice it's not a very large part. There's not much to this notch, so it's very easy to file it down too much and cause a problem. Now we can start fitting everything together. Anytime I do a trigger job, I always like to put heavy lubricant on all of the parts that I've worked on. This helps in the event that I forget to brush off any of the metal shavings, or metal shavings get in there, but it also helps everything slowly start to fit back together well and kind of almost self-polish it into place. And especially if you got a gun that's Cerakoted, the extra lubricant will help the Cerakote wear correctly. That'll help prevent any problems with fitment long term and just help everything wear better over time. Our final part to work on is the tail of that sear, and this is the part that interfaces with the trigger bow, bringing us full circle on this project and allowing us to finally put everything back together
and go get it test fired and make sure it's all working correctly. While fitting everything together, you have the opportunity to double check all of the parts in the fitment, and if you notice something's binding or snagging or it just doesn't seem like it's working as well as it should, go back and lightly, you'll notice I'm using my super fine grit sandpaper on this one, lightly tweak the polished points or the edges, and hopefully that'll bring everything back into alignment, which is what we're doing here, until it does all fit together. The biggest thing that's going to make a good trigger job stand out from a bad trigger job is the level of attention you pay to your final fit and finish, and that's what most people don't like about doing these, because it does require you to put the gun back together, tear it apart, put it back together, tear it apart, put it back together multiple times, as you can see me doing here. But in doing that, you make sure that that fitment is perfect, and taking the time now to ensure all of those parts are fitting together well and that everything is lining up correctly and sliding smoothly is going to pay off when you're finally finished with everything. Which is just about where we are. We've finally got everything fitting together more or less like it should. Just got a few little rough spots to take care of and finally get it all trued and working correctly. Now, just like before, as we're putting these together, we're going to heavily lubricate everything. And this is just going to reduce break-in period for these parts and make everything run more reliably. Now we'll do one last functions check and then it's off for test fire. Be right back.
Alright, so we had a little bit of fit and finish issues that we took care of. And that's fairly normal for a gun that's been freshly Cerakoted. What you have is the Cerakote increases the tolerances of the guns, which in this case is, well, in most cases is normally a good thing, because that lends itself to better accuracy and better fit and finish, which is exactly what we've got going on here. Just took it out, test fired it, had no issues, functioned great, gripped tight, trigger felt awesome, and I imagine we're looking at probably 4-pound trigger, give or take. I imagine it's going to be very similar to what it was before, and that's not a bad thing. What we did, we didn't remove a whole lot of material. We were mostly focused on polishing up surfaces and truing up surfaces. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a significant felt difference without actually changing a whole lot about the gun or even the trigger weight. And I mean, I've done guns. For me, my sweet spot's generally between 3 to 6 pounds on pistols. And depending on how you do it, a 6-pound trigger can feel phenomenal compared to a 3-pound trigger, as long as those surfaces are trued up. And that's why we focus so much on those crisp corners and making everything consistent throughout. That's the big focus with any kind of trigger job. But let's go ahead and see what we're at pull weight wise. And so we're right at about 5 with that one. So pretty close to where we were, actually a little bit higher. Let's go ahead and we'll do it one more time. And see. And we're pretty consistent here at 5, which is interesting. We've actually increased the pull weight slightly, but it feels completely different. And I wish there was a good way for us to translate. Yeah, so 5.7. So we actually increased the pull weight ever so slightly, which also isn't uncommon. That'll happen, and it just has to do with how the surfaces were meeting up before. A lot of times they won't seat correctly if they're out of alignment, and so you'll have essentially your sears not going like they should. Your sear and hammer and your surfaces aren't lining up well. So that's pretty much it. Not a whole lot to these trigger jobs. Big thing to focus on, like I said, is consistency and making sure those corners are true.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next video.